me, first of all, welcome you, Al. We are very happy to host you tonight in Advisors Free Webinars every Wednesday. Al is a dear friend of mine. He's an international authority. He specializes in project management and organizational excellence. He did, over his 30 plus years of experience, work with huge organizations in the Gulf and the Middle East and USA. He's joining us from Washington, DC, I believe, Al?
That's correct.
Okay. I'd like to thank the Guild of Project Controls Strategy Implementation Institute, several project management chapters, primarily Tunisia, Budapest, Saudi Arabia, Zimbabwe, Central Italy, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, Mauritius, and the last one we cannot see if we do not move, and Botswana. So having said that, I think now we are set, Al, for your start. So I'm going to hide. I'll be in the background and the floor is yours. So welcome again.
Thank you again, Dr. Sadi. It's a pleasure. And, this is, you've created a momentum, my friend. I mean, I'm trying to watch the series and trying to keep up with the kind of plans you have even going forward. And last week, having Antonio following also some of the work you've done and the other speakers lined up, etc. It's phenomenal. Antonio, I think left the house by exploding completely some of our views when it comes to projects. I know Antonio very well. He's a very good friend of mine, and we both served on the PMI Global Board of Directors together. And he cherishes and loves the whole notion of challenging our ways of thinking, which is something I admire and I share with him quite a bit. And I hope today as well, in this late hour, as you have, if you're celebrating Ramadan and having a night celebration, or you're in other parts of the world and may not be as late, but still you have the energy to stay with the dialogue and also interact with us with key questions and thoughts as well. Because even though he was focusing on the project economy and challenging the thought process there, which is a huge passion of mine, of course, and Dr. Sadi's as well. However, he left us with, I wrote down a couple of the takeaways for me, like when it comes to this whole notion, we focus so much on our constraints, and he wants to change our views from the internal to the external type of, or outward constraints, he called it, from an engagement standpoint and a relevance standpoint. I find that's phenomenal, and it lines very nicely and builds very beautifully on the topic of today, and my personal passion as well. I think one of the examples he mentioned I cannot also forget is, which I hope is going to be a main theme for our session today, is finding ways to get unstuck. I mean, we find ourselves in super unprecedented times, not the most pleasant of times necessarily at all when you hear the effects of a global pandemic like COVID-19, for example, and what it has done to the world and continues to leave unknowns and uncertainties. But at the end of the day, we got to have the trust, the faith, the momentum, the vision, and the ability to say, we ultimately either get out of this as human 2.0 or 3.0, like a much better version of ourselves, or we basically let this hit us in the negative ways, kind of like what we know organizationally from a risk standpoint. You have the threat side and definitely the opportunity side. So one of the things he said is getting unstuck. I remember he's talking about an example with a friend of his from Spain, and the gentleman, taking on this nice effort with Microsoft and basically accomplishing the results of the project. But then instead of being stuck, which when you reflect at those things and you look at your career and look at what you have been doing, and Sadi already made me quite older than I hopefully am, or coming across with all these experiences across organizations in the world. But the reality is, you don't want to be in a place where you keep doing the same thing and expect different outcome, as we know from an insanity standpoint or from an experience standpoint. It's not about the number. It's really about the richness. Yeah, you see in this title that Dr. Sadi left us with, I'm trying to have really a description of what I have been focusing on over the last several years. And this whole notion of future of work mechanic is very much to the heart of our discussion today. I want to find ways by which when I wrote myself some notes here, because I tried to have a small set of slides rather than too many, so I don't want to overwhelm you with data and graphs and so on. But then maybe share some stories and things that are relevant to you, and then also, decide what interaction we would have in the Q&A. But one note I wrote for myself: what am I talking to folks today about? So really, in reality, is how can I break down what's called organizational viruses? Not to overdo it with the current virus we're faced with, but in reality, this may be a super important reminder of the kind of viruses we have organizationally. We do have massive number of viruses in our organizations, and the biggest one is what I call the anti-agility. Is the note I wrote for myself. That's going to be a theme to what we talk about today. Dr. Sadi and I share this organizational agility passion, so I'm sure he can relate to that, and hopefully many of you can relate to that as well. And in a time like this, we find ourselves, and that's why this series is so powerful, if we're still in a place where we have any doubts that we need to be very different in how we adapt and how we approach things in a much more agile way. And I'm not talking here about, picking up a Scrum book, or, following exactly a sprint planning exercise or a pure IT angle. I'm talking about, organizationally speaking, mindset, thinking. So that's what I'm hoping to leave you. And also what I did is, as we start here, I think I'm going to have control of the slides as well if I click on this. Perfect. So as we start getting into it, I said, hey, try to walk the talk and practice what you preach. And the one thing that has been very important to me is finding ways to become more focused. So I wrote myself down, what are the 4 things I want to leave with folks, in this session. And one of the passions I have has been around, project management is great, and some of those elements are fantastic, but it's all about ultimately how can I take that on to the organization? How can I take that to the system within which I operate? And ultimately, we are all, much more than any other time in history now, we feel like a very well-connected global village. So there's an ecosystem, for lack of a better word, that connect us. So the 4 takeaways, I had something on the individual level, something on the process level, something on the organization level, and one on the system level. That's how I try to remind myself to look at the universe of what I do at work, the personal universe, everything we do on almost a daily basis. There's an individual component, a process, an organization, and ultimately a system. So on the individual level, and you correct me there at the end if we don't really tackle that, I wrote, and that kind of builds nicely on Antonio's kind of a focus when he talks about the project economy. So what I'm talking about today is more around what PMI and other organizations have been finding, and even more and more in these times, to be called power skills. We've been talking about all these soft skills and over the years. What we're realizing is with AI and the advances and the disruptions, it's really going to be center stage. Specifically, I want to talk about ambidextrity, if I can pronounce that correctly. How can I really be super adaptable, and also the elements pertaining to participative collaboration. We've always talked about collaboration, it's great, but ultimately, can it be truly intentional, and can it drive a level of participation in organizations that we have never seen before? And given the experience we are all in right now, how can we take that on and apply that into the future we're going into? And last on that first one is the empathy centricity. I've already been so amazed by it anyhow over the years, and how the top execs in organizations, instead of talking to us about cloud applications and this and that, they are really trying to get their teams and their organization to become much more centric around this notion of empathy. So I hope that comes across on the individual side. Second takeaway is going to be about what I would refer to on the process side as frictionless processes. I mean, I've been around, and so many of you around the room, I'm sure, have been around forever in projects and programs and organizations, and we've seen how processes can actually shoot us in the foot. We can almost make processes be the reason why we don't create, we don't innovate, etc. So there are a couple ideas around innovation today that I want to highlight that takes me to this: how can I get in my flow, as an individual now with the process, and can streamline how this can help me from a flow standpoint and from accomplishment for my, ownership of results, etc. in these organizations. So speaking of organization, at that level, I want to get us to understanding what does it take to become future organizations that are much higher in our risk resilience. I mean, if anything, if I can pick one thing that this notion we're going through should teach us from a takeaway, and we incorporate that back in the DNA of our organizations, is the resiliency around risk. that it's not a bad thing, that it's really got to be part of every daily dialogue we have. And that goes right to that preparation mindset that we have to have organizationally speaking. And then finally, at the system level, I want to get into some aspects pertaining to what does it take to start thinking again for a change? I mean, as simple as that sound, we need to think about what is the system paradigm change that we have to go through. Whereas, is it going to be new business models? Is it going to be new ways of working? Is it going to be a multitude of enablers to ensure that we're not going on we're trying to now to find a new normal around the world? Well, let's make our new normal a normal that is very centric around ensuring that there is thought process, there is provoking thoughts like some of the ones you're seeing here across the series, etc., and incorporating that into how we do things, right? So from a flow standpoint, I'm still going to have some bullets and agendas, try to control my thought process to a great extent. So it's going to be around these 3 bullets you see here. So first, I'm going to talk about the context for a couple more minutes, and then get into what's referred to as 3 spheres for excellence, right? So remember, the topic is operational sustainability. And to me, sustainability and excellence are almost like bolted, right? So you cannot talk about one without the other. They're nice build up, and we're not talking about, environmental sustainability. We're not talking about, those aspects. We're talking about operationally speaking. How can I make sure in these times and going forward, what are the things I need to be questioning and need to be rethinking through? And that's why I had the words here, innovation lens. At the end of the day, that is the kind of change in the DNA of the organization and in the way of working that we need to have, whereas innovation becomes almost a daily way of operating. And thus, not only would I sustain, but I would excel and also find the gears or the caliber that I would need to have in working into the future that is ahead of us, and hopefully a very strong and a bright one as well. The future of work roadmap would be then that last piece to try to pull some of these ideas together. So let's get into it. And context-wise, nothing probably would be a great context setting than the very classic VUCA terminology that many of us have already probably seen multiple number of times. This is a very old terminology. The fact that we've only talked about it in the last 3 years or X number of years surprises me tremendously. This comes from military academy type work that was done in Afghanistan at the time, because the terrain and the environment and everything else was rather complex. So volatility is the V, in case you forgot what the initials stand for, and the U is the uncertainty, and C is the complexity, and A is the ambiguity, right? So volatility, market-wise, conditions-wise, unknowns, and leading to also uncertainty and outcomes, and are we focusing on the right things? Are we asking the right questions, etc.? To complexity with people and type of project and type of business and so on, all the way to the ambiguity that can happen in multiple number of ways, and we sometimes create it ourselves. If anything at all, I think ambiguity comes from back to some of the things I want to talk to you about in process as well, for when we try to, or we forget or take our eyes off the ball in terms of, is this process to help? Is it to create less friction in how we do things? Or is it just because we're checking the box, or because a consultant or a best practice kind of an individual told me that I need to have it in place, right? So we really need to be very careful in terms of how this context that we are in has affected how we lead. And if we expect to lead as usual, and that's why I started by saying we really should be thinking human 3.0. I'm skipping 2.0, or we may already have lots of articles already on human 2.0, but the reality is we need to, given this experience we're in, decide how to design from a reskilling, from a mindset, from a way of working, from a way of interacting in organizations. What is that 3.0 going to look like? So, speaking of the pandemic, would it have been possible to have a program manager across the board if you use the terminology of projects and project management? Maybe what kind of a person would that be? Hopefully that's in the backdrop or in the back of our mind as we go through our, discussion on this topic. And then also this fluidity aspect. How could we have that fluidity in governing? One big theme that no matter what experience I've had, and Dr. Saadi mentioned the experience in the Middle East, and I was 4.5 years in operating out of Abu Dhabi, doing work in KSA and multiple parts of the region. Originally grew up in Egypt and Cairo, so I've known the environment, etc. But still, governing and the ability to really gauge exactly, how can we create enough fluidity. I hope so. Back to anchor, why the videos, to give you part of a context and setting the stage. So we picked 3 videos, as you had the chance hopefully to watch. The first one with Simon is, to me, truly, as simple as that message is going to go right to the core of our session today, because I remember in the individual side, I wanted to create that human 3.0 that is able to finally utilize the importance of these power skills. Finally utilize that certain behaviors are innovation killers. Certain behaviors are creating the unsafe environments that ultimately lead to misleading elements pertaining to governance, etc. as well, right? Because you want to have, remember what he said, guy walks into the room, says, here's a problem, here's a solution, let's go around the room and tell me, what you think. Right there, we ruin the place. One of my favorite sayings when I go into any organization, whether in a consulting role, or whether in the organizations I worked for as an employee, whether it was manufacturing, whether engineering, whether it's no matter what industry I was in, I always have a saying that says, what does the smell of the place look like, right? So, or feel like, or smell like, depends on how we hopefully interpret smell. But the smell of the place is not to be underestimated. You can tell right away what kind of an environment and a culture by how the teams interact, how they work. Is there that kind of openness in the dialogue? Is conflict cherished? My first indication for our organizations is how we view conflicts at the individual level, at the organization level. If that's not almost like part of the daily core values of a given organization, I already know the place doesn't smell good. It's not going to allow me the sustainability that I want to see in my operation as well. The other video, by the way, was there definitely for a reason as a backdrop for this, right? Because here we talk about how to ensure the vital learning is understood, captured, and widely positively implemented. Well, if you look at COVID-19, and if we were talking just about what I call the shadow side, so it has a shadow side and it has a gift side, right? And the reality is, if you truly believe things happening for a reason, whether it's a wake-up call, whatever it is, for you and your beliefs and your mindset, but ultimately there's a gift side, and that gift is learning. The Spotify example is an example of an organization that did believe very, very completely and comprehensively that the power comes from getting the people to own, getting the people to work in an autonomous way. This autonomous way of working that you saw there, whether you believe in agile principles or not, it's really the way in the future. It's the way now that we are uncovering. Or if you look at data and reports, productivity is going up in some cases, depends on the industry and the way of working. If you look at the ways of working and the ways of connecting, companies like Zoom, for example, 131% growth since January, etc. of this year. I mean, that tells me that we can flex, we can learn, we can adapt. And the cross-pollination you saw in that video of ideas that happen across those teams is something we want to see really core at this operational sustainability topic that we are addressing as well. And then the last one, if anything at all that's going to affect us going forward and how we lead is some of the ideas Renee Brown has mentioned in that video. Phenomenal. If you think about as simple a word as vulnerability, whether we're talking about how we empathize differently, how we connect differently, to think of this as a strength. I can tell you when it comes to my biggest learning, watching others, and maybe go back here so you don't start thinking about the poll immediately, where we're going to have that activated here in a second. But if you think about people who have affected your sense of leading and why you have passion around leading, I get a lot of questions all the time from colleagues, from people I coach or trainees, whatever the case might be. What's the difference between leading and managing? And we get confused. And if I have two people and I have to sacrifice one, which one would I sacrifice, etc. So it's not a winning dialogue, but it's at the end of the day, you want to for sure err on the side of making sure there are leadership qualities, that there are examples that are to replicate across the team. My biggest example is my dad, passed many years ago, etc. However, one attribute I learned from him that hopefully every day I try to remember in the relationship to the context of this topic here, which is not only was he humble, he was like a sponge, right? So, sustainable organizations are learning organizations. They are sponge-like organizations. They are continuously vulnerable. They continuously don't have the answers. One of the worst things that can happen to us, as you know very well, is to succeed, and success becomes our worst enemy because, again, we get weak. Our muscles get weaker. So let's get on a first poll. Let's give it a shot. And I think Sadi and team have the control of that. Unless you tell me otherwise, Sadi, I'm happy to do it. And so you will see the poll come up, and then we'll get some results out of it. All right, so you have 4 answers here, and the question is, what is the most highly valued ingredient for operational sustainability in your organization? Controls as well, so I'll give it another quick second or two, and then we'll close it. All right, so let's end it. So looks like if I look at the results here, it looks like we have the connectedness of team as the winner, not by far, but definitely is getting 33%, looks like it, and then followed by a tie between the other two, cascading of the vision across the organization and the strength of execution. There's no right or wrong answers, obviously, in these kind of polls, right? They at the end of the day are all very valued. And even though he scored 7% on the last one, I'm a big fan of the last one, by the way. Having time to think again, if I can think about one thing to improve on personal level and or organizationally speaking, is for goodness sake, we need to dedicate time to think again. We are not, like literally blocking time on our calendars, like going to your Outlook or whatever way you can manage your calendar and really having the time to think. This is me time. This is not me time to relax. You can, of course, if you think thinking relaxes you, but it's really me time to reflect and find out, the meanings and the things we want to put in practice, etc. The cascading effect, I'm glad you picked that as well. I think one of the things as we start our journey here is I'm a strong believer of a tool that years back I was introduced to. Actually, I was in Dubai at the time. It was a PMI board meeting, and we had a speaker, someone facilitating the discussion, De Flander, I think it was his name, a guy from Belgium. And basically, he was the first one to remind me of the importance of something called the power of the 3H, right? So 3H, if you think about it, is the head and the heart and the hand. A lot of the things we're talking through today as far as really getting our organization to be synchronized, and that's why if you see here the cascading vision, is when the 3 align. When we have a very clear, nicely articulated view of where we are heading organizationally speaking, what really matters, what are the key critical questions that we should, intellectually speaking, put in the front and the center of us at any given point. But you can be the best intellectual, you can have the nicest degrees and the nicest ideas. If you cannot connect to the heart, if you cannot really drive that connection and the motivation, as you know, that's where the second H comes in. Forget about the execution. Because again, even when you heard some thoughts in the previous series about the importance of taking the ideas into reality and the execution of strategy and how important it is to really focus on that, well, you're not going to focus on that and you're not going to get the right execution. You're not going to have the right leadership unless you are able as a leader to drive that second H for sure. And that's where the cascading takes place. So strength of execution is important, but without the ability to cascade and the connectedness of the team. So almost the first and the third choice here are very strong in terms of driving. How can we ensure that we are going to have connected organizations taking us into what we need to be doing into the future as well? So let's tackle the 3 spheres. And at the end also, you'll see that I'm going to have a link for you to look at an article I published in what's called The Dialogue, is a publication that has captured my views around this in a bit more detail. So we have 3 spheres. I picked the people, the process, and basically the governance, right? So tackling those dimensions, even though the way I explained the takeaways is around 4 elements. So I'll go back to them. But here, just as you saw, in some of the videos, when you look at Simon, if you look at, some of the elements of Spotify, etc., what I have seen time and again is that we've got to find a way, when you look at the bullets here, to find a way where we are becoming much more tilted towards agility. And again, I'm pleading almost for all of us to, whether or not you've liked what you've heard about agile or etc., I care less about whether or not you're taking that on as really a way of managing or a way of directing projects, etc. I care a lot more about agility of the mindset, agility and the kind of competencies that we have in the organization. I still remember when sitting with some very senior folks in the, for example, in the Dubai government, even though I worked a lot more with the Abu Dhabi government, for example, if you talk about governments, and sometimes, of course, there might be slightly different views, it's absolutely fine. But to hear from very top levels of the government that we want the government to be agile. You can tell there, and also in meetings I've had in Riyadh or in Khobar, working with a few of the organizations, agility has been a very important topic on the plate of many organizations. Matter of fact, when you don't have that and you don't have good sensing, so people can, I cannot tell you that one of my worst experiences, 2016 is the date, summer 2016. After all these years of experience, I'm showing up to Leverkusen, that's Bayer or Bayer, however you want to pronounce it. We've done some work for them, was delivered by the consultants, etc., on the job, assessing some of their processes and so forth. Everything signed off, accepted, paid, seemed like everything was fine. I wasn't even involved in the work. I was new to the team. And then I walk in, and I was invited to show up. I happened to be in Europe anyhow at the time. I was invited to show up to the meeting. And it was one of the most hostile meetings I've ever been to my life. Talk about smell of the place I was talking about earlier, right? You can tell tension, there's complete apprehension and so on. So I had to, as we call it, peel the onion, find out what's the issue here. And it had nothing to do with the work. They said, Al, your consultants came in, did the work, gathered the information, went away, disappeared for X number of weeks, dumped, let's call it, the report on us, and it looked great and everything else. But that's not what we wanted. Not that the report is not what they wanted. That's not what they wanted, period, right? So, unless you have this intentional collaboration secret sauce I'm talking about, unless you have the attributes of agility here, which is you have a massive learning appetite, you want to experiment, you want to find quick ways to tilt and make decisions fast, etc., our team would not have ever guessed it. And what they only wanted out of that exercise was to engage their organization. They had a problem in change management. It has nothing to do with the actual deliverables, etc., that we're assessing the process and, the review points and interactions and governance, leading to governance here shortly. So we have to be very careful about sensing properly. And that's what we need to have. So whether we start becoming more digitally enabled, using AI, you heard Antonio talk about disruption happening and the PMs are going to be, all their functions are gone, etc. Well, I believe it and don't believe it. The PMs have got to, as probably what he was indicating as well, to rethink their approach. It's very important for us to rethink our approach, and we find ways to reskill very differently so that we build on the digital side, but we really bring forth that power skills I was referring to earlier, especially the ability to adapt and ability to use this ambidextrity, right? The explore kind of a thing, right? You want to be able to have this hunt for exploration, different ways of doing business, but also protect, of course, assets and know-how, etc. in the team. Process, to me, when I mentioned that, one of the takeaways better be that we find frictionless processes. A guy who have been around PMI forever, almost my entire career, who've been around organizations across industries, for me to say, watch out for the damage processes could create. It's, it takes a lot on my part to be stretched enough to say that. But the reality is, I've seen it time and again. If we aren't aware of what the impact is, or that we have the right fitting processes, we're not going to be in our flow. We're going to find ourselves individually, collectively, organizationally speaking, doing things that may not be best suited for what is really at hand as a mission, etc. Right? So the secret formula here is what I'm stating, is that we have to find the fitting processes. We cannot choke progress in any part of the organization's strategic goals at the expense of another. That does require us also to be able to step away. One of the things that I always try to find ways by which to remind myself, remind my colleagues and others I work with, are we able to zoom in and out? And at some point I mentioned to you a couple of the books even that I highlighted, a couple of things for us to think about if you're into developing some of those capabilities as well. It's huge. As simple as it is, if I don't have that ability to step away and to rethink, back to the thinking aspect, does this fit our culture? Does this fit our need to focus, to balance? This here about balancing the individual creativity and ownership. Anytime I'm going to shoot individual creativity in the foot, and that's why I love the messages in Spotify video there, is that, I can't afford that. I don't want to create a complete chaos, but I want to also create a very well-balanced mix between the two sides of the equation, again, between the autonomy that you saw and the alignment level. That's what processes do for us, and then ultimately that they help me set the stage for strong governance. The word I chose here is the word hybrid. I cannot think of another word, and whether you put a lens on or a hat on that you're thinking about it from a program or a portfolio level, or you're thinking about it in terms of organizationally speaking, whichever lens you have on, without being hybrid in our approach in this day and age, no sustainability can happen. Operationally speaking, project speaking, you name it, right? Because the reality is, this is the least we need to do when it comes to our ability to deal with the implications that we have from the COVID-19 kind of an experience that we're going through. That is a must. For us to think about excellence, as you see in the bullets here, we have to be able to shift very easily from this. You saw the nature of steering focus to much more delivery focus. Maybe that was hinted a little bit too in that video, but the reality is, I've worked across organizations like Bosch, for example. If you think of Bosch, one great example for how they shifted. And I, didn't encounter it as much in Bosch, but I have some other German-based organizations like that who have done a very good job with it. But in Bosch's case, you go to the boardroom, it's all whiteboards everywhere. You're seeing basically the board and the leadership team standing and rolling up the sleeves, becoming the terminology of agility, like product owners, let's call it. It doesn't matter what the terminology is, but they are scaling ways by which they can get things done with a lot less focus on control, the classic focus usually we think about when we think governance, and their focus is much more, focus on making sure that things are happening, things are flowing, that the processes give us the flow, and that ultimately we have the ability, especially that third bullet, to tilt fast as a culture. This day and age, and that's why when events like this hit us that hard, the ones who are able to tilt, the ones who are able to rethink their business models, etc., are not only doing well, they are actually doing super well, which is mind-boggling almost to see that. So if anything, we want to tilt towards much more a delivery focus, to results focus. You heard also terminology of benefits. If the government is really not enabling us to measure and achieve those benefits and get them as an outcome of these initiatives that are taking place, that definitely would become a very big hindrance there. Right? So 3 components that have to go hand in hand, but ultimately when you tie them to the topic of our session, how does that help me from an operational sustainability standpoint? It's very important that we balance, the use of the 3, but also balance them around, at the end of the day, will I be able to upskill and develop enough of the digital appetite where I depend less on the things that require less of my expertise and my thinking and my ability to shape change, etc. So I have the data and the AI-based information and the themes and the data analytics working to my advantage, so I can focus more on this the expedient decision-making process, the speed by which I make decisions, the quality of the decisions I make. Every one of us around the room this evening, basically really in that space. They are pretty much across the space of how can we ensure we're making the right decisions, especially given constraints and uncertainty, this VUCA universe that we live in, and also are they the right, to the best possible, grouping of data points, etc., and minimization of bias, of course, that affects that. And of course, the most important thing we're finding is this refreshed sponsorship model, right? So that becomes huge in our ability as an organization to make sure that we're not going to be affected or biased by this high focus on governance and the high dependency on that, and much more on being hands-on, being much more related. I'm not talking hands-on to get us to a place where we are, finding what we call meddlers, right? You don't want to get your executive team to meddle. You want your executive team to back to leadership, to exemplify, to be truly, the servant leadership model that we have been talking through and trying to build in our organizations over the years. All right, so to tie it all together for that first key part and to bring it to something I'm truly passionate about, is that when we look at the future of organizations, when we try to really, balance the 3 components to create this kind of a sustained and also excelling way of delivering and doing business, one of the things that I found to be very useful is to think about it from the innovation lens. And this actually goes straight to one of the 5 books or so at some point I want to be hinting towards. So that's one of them already, comes straight from the work I put into his very first chapter in that book, actually, Dr. Kersner. And this one is the innovation project management, right? So in that chapter, he asked me, all right, so help me out, Al, here. If you're looking at it from your experience, what are some of the things that really allow us, going into this kind of the future we have, the different ways of working, what are the things we have to focus on? So definitely that first one about the boardrooms becoming workrooms was, to me, like a must, right? This classic boards, one of the things I've done in Abu Dhabi that I enjoyed tremendously, working with the board of directors for the organization I was with at the end in the energy industry, is to really make sure that the board is focused a lot less on data and flux of presentations, etc., and turning them into a really dynamic, what I call healthy governance kind of a culture by basically becoming much more of a workroom. So everyone would have an iPad, would have a beautiful, simple way to map exactly what's happening from a business standpoint, from an organization standpoint against their strategic objectives. So they dedicate the time to think and debate and to tackle big conflicts, etc., and thus benefit the organization. Boards need to rethink completely where they spend their time, as you heard even Antonio allude to that a little bit. The road ahead is enriched by team autonomy. Nothing to me is as important as that. We've experienced that very well now, and we've seen the impact of it. We've seen the organizations who do a good job with it. So we want to find ways by which let's tighten this. Let's make sure autonomy is not something only we live, something we are going to enable in how we do things. Remember, culture eats strategy for breakfast every given day. Our famous Peter Drucker saying, right? So many of those hinge on, like in that third bullet, can I create the culture? This whole fail fast and learn kind of a way of mindset behind agile, etc. This is going to have to be the new normal, regardless again of how much we start tilting towards agility. Yeah, projects are tomorrow's innovation labs. I am so much committed to this. The major thing left in my career journey is to make sure that I'm going to get initiatives at large, projects, programs, etc., to be viewed as tomorrow's innovation labs. To think about projects just to accomplish things or to achieve benefits, as you heard in the series before, or that's all nice, but it's the limitation. We want, personally, I want, and colleagues of mine and partners of mine want to ensure that projects are tomorrow's innovation labs. We're using the project to test a lot of ingredients, how we collaborate, how we work together, how we think, how we pull the right team mix together. So looking at all that you can do when you use projects for that purpose, hopefully can be, almost like a platform of taking off. So we start avoiding being in situations where we haven't thought through things as much as maybe this experience we're going through as a world teaching us as well. So very important to think about the potential value of number 4. The leader is a coach, right? When I am asked that question, the best leaders, whether again you're going to go full agile or not, that's why there's a high focus on the coaching attribute. And early on in my career and later in my career, every time when I did a lot around programs, etc., and they asked me, so Al, what do you do? Well, my role is to get out of the way. The more I can get out of the way and the more I'm there to support and to listen and empathize and relate and those kinds of things that are under the power skills, that's when I can really excel in my role and my function. Yeah. So finding ways where, again, by that vulnerability you watched in Brown, by finding yourself able to get to the soaking aspect we were talking about earlier in terms of learning, hopefully can help tremendously in getting to that. And then again, being reflective again. That's where operations excellence can happen. Is if we find ways by which we are reflecting and finding ways by always going back to what matters in terms of holistically speaking, then organizations can do much better in terms of sustaining the operation. And then the future way of working is smoothly flowing. If anything else, let's find the mix, the processes, the kind of skill sets, the kind of governance, etc. Because one of the things, if as simple as this really funny, simple picture tells me, is if I can get back to this is a massive itch. If I get back to that beginner's mind, this at the end of the day will allow me to have limitless possibilities. That's really what happens here, right? Experience works against this. And that's why when Dr. Sadi was talking about experiences in years, the worst thing that happened with that experience is that we become stuck. We become in a place where we are, relying so much on that experience rather than being in a place where, say, I don't know anything. Every day is a learning experience, right? Yes, yesterday's experience led to X, but by the way, what's next? And that's even, we don't talk anymore about best practices. We always shape the road for what's called next practices. What can you do to shape those next practices? What can you do operationally speaking, project speaking, system speaking, where you are able to even use this power here? And the picture is very powerful. When I mentioned earlier that we want to have a shift in the system and the way of thinking, as simple as the ability to find those zoom in and out capabilities and really, sharpen those muscles, the better off we'll be. what's the advantage of getting onto the balcony? You see the dynamics, you see the interactions, you see what's really failing, what's really working, you see where the harmony is, you see where things smell good, things don't smell good. You have the ability to truly strengthen that ability that ultimately can strengthen our success as a team. So let's tackle this next one so it can take us to the next piece here, right? And this is hopefully a simple one talking about, so what does that future of work might look like? If you're designing that map for it, where would you design it? More on data, more on involvement of team, adaptability of approach, or creating early outcomes and testing opportunities? What kind of a mix here? What's the right inclination here in the team? And let's end it. All right, so it looks, again, no surprise at all if you start looking at the data and you see that the involvement of the team is getting 41% of our views here across the room. There's no doubt that continues and will continue to be shaping how we work in the future, because the worst thing that can happen is, you come up with a new model or a business model for your business or a new way of working, and you're not fully involving the team. It's one thing to say to the team, here, this is the way, go forward, take this on and run with it, as and it's a totally different exercise when the team is truly part of that. It's a complete design. And in Arabic, we call it tabha. So it's, Saudi always laughs with me about the difference between a cook and a chef, right? So a chef at the end of the day is truly able to use all the ingredients, all the right inputs, kind of like what Simon was talking about also in that initial video, by being able to truly sit back and, that's where the wisdom comes in. Get all the inputs, get the opinions, and then ultimately, and then of course, anchor that in adaptability. That's your second choice, which is spot on. That goes a long way. Data is great. It helps tremendously. And of course, finding early testing opportunities are wonderful. You pick the two that, to me, at the end of the day, will create a magical combination. You get the team right, and you get your approach, or get the team right and involved. You're talking to the right individuals and right stakeholders, etc., and then finding an approach that ultimately can give me, enough of the thing that we're talking about. Then we are in a very good place, right? So if you look at the future of work, I mean, in reality, it could be a super, super positive place to be, right? It's hard to see it now. It's hard to see that when we are, faced with events like the size and the magnitude and the complexity. But the reality is, given what we have already been putting in place, and given any real learning that can happen in an experience like this, where we can think truly and holistically about, wow, we've had so many enablers, we've gotten to a place where we're able to accomplish a lot. However, we may have not paid attention to this, we may have not paid attention to that, whether it's we didn't invest enough in how the additional capability is helping us, as you can see in the notes, or how we didn't manage to really get enough focus on the rolling up the sleeve mentality when it comes to the delivery focus, when it comes to, again, how much of we're tailoring, as in that second bullet talks about tailoring to the context. Are we paying enough attention to the context, not just for me organizationally? Every one of us around the room are in a serving capacity, whether you're serving a client, you're serving a purpose or a mission, etc. So the reality is we lose sometimes sight of that context. That's why I intentionally had slides like the beginner's mind, or I had a slide that talks about this whole ability to get onto the balcony. We need to always rethink the context. Designing the wow, as we call it, and even PMI now has I believe with the disciplined agile component, has invested in that, even though you can see in the components a bit more inclination towards the IT world, etc. You can take a lot of that and start thinking also about how can I apply that in my context. How does that apply to me if I'm doing a major refinery work in case some water, or I'm trying to take that work into a very high complexity construction project that's going to go under a channel and over a mountain, for that matter, right? So again, the reality is the excellence comes from this third bullet, which is, can we in that design think of what is going to take to have that learning attribute, right? The safe culture. If anything at all, out of many of the experiences, like when I look, for example, at I believe that some of the things we've been doing, for example, organizations like Heidelberg Cement, it's a great organization that is also German based, and I've been doing some work with them even in Africa and places like Togo, etc. You can tell the human mind is ready to increase its level of agility and ways of working, being much more autonomous, like you've seen in the early videos in the session today. But the reality is we got to invest in what it takes to get us there, culturally speaking, organizationally speaking, process speaking. So you got to look at all those four dimensions that I started the session with: the individual, the process, the organization, and the system. I'm investing in all four equally to make sure the environment is set right. All right. So to wrap it up, so we can have enough time for questions as well. If I look at maybe one thing before we highlight a couple of the key things. When I mentioned books, so I wrote myself down notes for some of the books that I think would shape your views quite a bit. The first one I have here on the list is called Detonate. All right, so Detonate, again, the reason I like some of the ideas in Detonate, that's the name of the book, is this whole notion of the beginner's mind. I think really in that book, they nail that. How the beginner's mind allow that mindset, not just a growth mindset, but it's more possibilities mindset. How can I get to really a place where I can get rid of some of the classic views and hindrances that we have? I remember when I started the session with you, I mentioned to you, I want to talk to you about organizational viruses, the things that are affecting our ability to be in our flow. The second one is Sense and Respond. Right. So over the years, I was introduced to that book. And the reason it will help you if you're interested in that side of what was mentioned in one of the videos around autonomy. So Sense and Respond is really all about autonomous, mission-based, team kind of a setting that you can translate easily into the world of projects and programs, etc., if that's where your focus is. Then the other one is called blitz scaling, right? So this is actually, blitz scaling, from the sound of it, of course, is about, finding ways to create, massive scaling. And that's why, again, the guys talking agile usually talk about scaling agile and those things. But blitz scaling is not really in the agile path or anything. It talks about organizations, talks about what it takes. What I wrote myself a note here to remind myself of is also the first scalar advantage. Remember, we talked about urgency. We talked about the importance of utilizing as strength in our decision making to know exactly when is the right timing to be doing the scaling and how can I take the lead there. And then the fourth one I had is what's called the 10x rule. All right, the 10x rule. Again, has been circulating now for some time, and I think there what I find to be very interesting in that book, also chapter 15, I think it's titled "Burn the Place Down." Right, so what I find interesting there is it reminds me of my own personal experience. Success can truly, as I mentioned earlier, be your worst enemy. Anytime I walk into a team and organization and say, how are things? Oh, everything's great. Our life is good. And I say, oh my God, I'm really in troubled state right now, right? Because that's, again, I want transparency on steroid. I want a culture where at the end of the day, success is nice, I can build on, but I want people to be comfortable enough to experience, to share their opinion, to speak up. We cannot go into the 2022, hopefully, when the world is much more clear on the way of working, and into the 2030, etc., without really having mastered exactly what is it going to take in terms of the DNA that we have in these organizations. And the fifth is the one I mentioned earlier, which is the Kerzner Innovation Project Management book. I believe there what I like about it is challenging assumptions. So just like Antonio started, and like hopefully some of the ideas we've been talking through today, we want to challenge our ways of really looking at our organizational DNA and how we empower, how we create autonomy, how we ensure exactly that we're going to think differently for a change. Those things are going to be very important to sustain our operations as well. So those would be examples of the five. I think those are the key ones I wrote that I wanted to remind you of. And then as a recap, before we start looking at some dialogue and questions, is there is a need to balance the three. Those three needs that I suggested around the people and the process and the governance. They have to almost be looked at like that, like very tightly, and think of it as a gauge. The best analogy I've always used when I tackle this is I put each one on a gauge, like you saw on the slides, and move that needle a little bit on the gauge. Is it really a balance between the leadership side and the digital side on the person? Is it really balanced between, the delivery focus, for example, versus the more controlling focus? So exactly where are you going to move on those needles so that you figure out exactly what fits? If anything at all, that hopefully is a key message today is we need to be very clear on our context. I have been in so many situations, organizational speaking and project speaking, where literally business and project fail before they start. I'm a big believer in that. Again, projects fail before they start because it's really about the lack of context. If we did not understand the context, if we did not understand exactly why that is existing, or this new business endeavor, or this new way of operating, if we don't ask the right questions, literally change your questions, you change your direction and answers completely and the destiny altogether. And that's what organizations that excel do. If you're familiar with EFQM, some of you already may have been down that path. That's one of the things I learned very, very, very deeply in the Middle East, for example. Those kinds of principles hopefully apply here to how can we innovate, how can we find ways by which our future can become much more resilient in a way and ahead of uncertainties like today. So Sadi, I think it's a good time hopefully now to start diving. I hope there's some good dialogues there. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Al. It has been really a tough session, okay? Lots of interesting concepts and ideas to recap on. I believe many of us are going to watch it again. One thing that many asked for, can you kindly write on the chat the names of the books that you just mentioned?
100%, I can do that.
If you can do it now,
I am doing
I'm
it.
just gonna go. I'm just gonna go and prepare a couple of questions. I believe we have. Before we start the questions, I just want to. Okay, we're gonna share details of Dr. Al Zeitoun. Anybody who wishes to speak to him, we're gonna share this with you. Then I would like to invite again everybody to attend tomorrow's session at 10 p.m. KSA. It's a panel on strategy implementation, practice, and certification. I'm gonna be moderating. Antonio again, Nieto Rodriguez, and we are very happy to host tomorrow Mark Langley. Of course, Al knows Mark better than any of us because you served with him for several years on the PMI. So tomorrow, this is the session. If you like to register for tomorrow, perhaps Mustafa can put the session on the chat so that people can register if they wish to attend tomorrow. Also, I'd like to reiterate again, next week's session will be at 9 p.m. KSA by Dr. Radia Ben Alia. There's also the session for the registration. And I believe Dr. Radia is with us tonight. Maybe she will join in a bit. Then I'm looking at a couple of questions. Presentation, we'll send it to you, don't worry. Okay. I find the question. From Ahmad Abdel Salam. Ahmad is a very nice person. He's from Tunisia. He works in Tunisia and Morocco. Thank you for the insightful talk. Would you please share some thoughts regarding organization resilience enablers?
That's a great question, Ahmad. Thank you for that. This is a tough one because, again, at the end of the day, the direct answer is finding ways to work on its autonomy, right? Because, to me, when I mentioned to you at the beginning the power skills, I would say I would go to the exact notes I mentioned to you. So I would work on, for a resilience standpoint, right? I work on their ambidexterity, right? So make sure that the organization has enough healthy balance between the explore and the exploit. A lot of our organizations are focused so much on exploiting, right? So how can I make the best use of our team, et cetera, and so forth. Organizations that are resilient are going to be ones that are much more in the exploring side. They want to come up with new ideas, a lot of creativity. They, enable that autonomy. Also, that's why, you see Dr. Radia's kind of next session there. Remember when I talked about empathy-centric? That's why I would believe that next session is going to be super important when it comes to also creating that resiliency, because you do want individuals who can empathize well, and that's why Sense and Respond, as one of the books, I hope I managed to, or remember to mention it on the list as well, would be an example for you to do that. That's all about resiliency, is how can the organization truly capitalize on where we are today and the access to data, et cetera, but realize that it's all about, at the end of the day, the different individual and the very totally looked at differently from a reskilling standpoint, kind of an individual, right? And finally there, the ability, obviously, to do this, what I called at the beginning, participative collaboration. I cannot emphasize that enough, no matter how digitally we become. And I'm not talking about collaboration for the sake of collaboration or just working on a team and having a good time. No, I'm talking about very intentional. We know exactly what we're after, which is really creating an environment that's truly participative. That's the core of it. And that's where resiliency, in my opinion, comes from. Ahmed, it's a great question. Thank you. You're on mute, Dr. Sadi. Sorry, try again. You're still on mute. I know you're trying to minimize the echo, so go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Radia, are you on? I saw you join us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Lots of echo, eh?
Okay, I'd like first of all to welcome you for our next session. And I believe that you have a question for Al here.
Yeah, thank you, Al, for the presentation. Always nice to hear about the tech side of things. I wanted to say something. I was wondering.
One second. Dr. Sadi, you want to go on mute?
Too much echo?
Okay, yeah, now it's perfect. Go ahead.
It's okay now? All right. So I was wondering, like you've made, I think, the case for my next session with, leadership and emotional intelligence and such. And I was wondering if it's something that was always easy to talk about, or if there's been a paradigm shift sometime in the last decade, because I noticed at first when I used to talk about leadership, it was like, yeah. So it was almost seen like an add-on feature, communication skills, leadership skills, flexible thinking agility, good communications, and so forth. Now, I feel that people have more the courage to talk about it. So my question to you is, did you fight through it? And what do you think this pandemic will do to, perspective on leadership and emotional intelligence?
Yeah, it's a phenomenal question, and it's a very good question to set things up for the next session. And your session, and I was just saying that, hopefully you were on already when I said that, is so fundamental for a variety of reasons. So whether it builds on what Antonio addressed with the project economy. So project economy, the number one take from that project economy, in my opinion, is that we finally have a massive wake-up call when it comes to those skills, right? So anyone who's going to stand at the executive level, especially in front of a room and say, hey, these things are soft, and I'm not going to invest in that. You're kind of wasting my time, etc. He or she are not relating to the times, right? Because you see already PMI and organizations like that are shifting to thinking of them as power skills. You saw that in the Pulse of the Profession, the last one. There's a great one to look at as well, pertaining to the teams of the future, right? The reality is, the power skills, the reason they are power skills is because that's what the real power is, right? So for me, was it hard? Absolutely, it was hard. Did I have to have a major wake-up calls personally and the ones I'm working with? 100%. Remember, I'm an engineer by training. I'm a PhD in engineering. I think of things as black and white, etc. And so finally, when I got my wake-up years back, luckily it was already 10, 15 years ago, when I was literally working on those kind of situations I was sharing on the session earlier, where I deliver beautifully, but then it creates no resonance. This example I mentioned in Leverkusen with the pharmaceutical company, the deliverables were outstanding, paid for, and everybody was happy. So the message was, well, you missed it because you were not empathizing, you were not connecting, you did not have the real caliber. The beauty of your topic and how it started resonating with me, and I started getting across to the executives and others, is that, hey, wouldn't it be great if you can actually develop something that you can do without having to invest in something dramatically difficult for your individuals? Like IQ is so hard to invest in. Teaching something new, technology-wise, etc. Yes, people will, you can watch YouTube, etc. But if it's not part of your DNA, it's going to be a hard shift. EQ and the notion of these power skills is something that, by creating those autonomous environments I was talking about today, you are actually allowing people to get to that experimentation mindset that we'll need in the future, because that's what's going to be left. I mean, Antonio was scary. I mean, when I listened to his session, he was basically saying we're gone as project managers. So what's left is truly your topic next time, and hopefully that's enough of a wake-up call to us individually and to our organizations. COVID-19, and please, one of the things when you check my LinkedIn profile with an Indian colleague of mine a couple of weeks back, and I have to reshare it again. I had her put it for both of us, but I'll reshare it later today. It's really the point I was making earlier. COVID-19 is a phenomenal, in spite of all the terrible sides of it, but it's really this shadow and gift side to it. It's a phenomenal wake-up call for us in terms of who we need to be, and that human 3.0 I was referring to at the beginning. And I really wish you well on your session. I think it's a phenomenal session, inshallah. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Al.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, Radia. Al, we are past our time, but I still have 2 or 3 very interesting questions. So
I'm glad we kept people so late like that. So late.
Okay, there's a question from Imad Muhaysan. Okay, he's a great guy from Aramco, and they have the interesting collaboration of petrochemical and oil and gas companies in the Gulf. He's saying, great enriching session, Dr. Al. Is there a direct relation between resilience and operational sustainability?
Can you repeat the last part one more time? Because I got tried with all these chat box stuff.
Okay. He's asking about whether there is a direct relation between resilience and operation sustainability.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, thank you for that. Let's go on mute again.
I'm gonna go mute.
Yeah, it's interesting how these medium, the echo makes a big difference. So is there a direct correlation between resilience and operational sustainability? It's more than direct linkage, right? It's actually at the core of it. So every experience I've had over the years, and even without having to deal with the COVID-19, I was writing myself some notes here, examples of the things I've watched in organizations, and it's mind-boggling. If I look at the list of experiences I went through recently where I saw that, oh my goodness, that's why these organizations are disappearing, is because they never had built those resilience muscles, right? If you look at this day and age, of course, you cannot blame them to be stuck like that. Talk about the airline industry, for example, right? Is there any resilience, right? We're seeing in the airline industry? Are they operationally sustainable? It's so unfortunate, but it's part of the reality of it that says, have they built any muscles, any ways of working, any diversification in their business model, et cetera, to allow for times like this? Have they looked at the ups and downs that are potential? Have they, and not to criticize one industry, but just to think about what does it take for us to, from really building, different mindset, different ways of thinking, because what's left is what? Just slash the payroll and get rid of certain model of an aircraft, etc. With all due respect, that's great, but is that really is that all we have? Is this allowing that autonomy and creativity that we would have otherwise have had with a much higher focus? Remember this one line, item number 4 on my list of 7, the project says innovation lab. That's where I believe resiliency can be built. You really build it by having an arsenal of ideas. In a time like this, COVID-19 hits us, those ideas are ready to roll. We're not faced with our pants down like we use as an expression, right? So the answer to your question, very direct correlation between the two. And if anything, I hope we go away from this with a high focus on becoming a much more learning type of an organization where we invest heavily in the arsenal, like a think tank kind of an organization. Is no exaggeration, no fancy expression anymore. That becomes part of how we work.
Okay, interesting. I have a question of my own actually, based on that. What about organizational agility within the whole thing? Okay, I'm very much focused, as you said at the beginning, on the agility thing, not from the perspective of IT. It's good for the software development lifecycle to utilize agile methods, brings faster, better products, more customer-centric. But the whole manifesto of agility, it applies to everything else. But I believe there is a lot of research, of practical platforms to be discovered, and all these should lead to operational sustainability. Or what do you think?
So first on mute. So Dr. Sadi, you're hitting the core of my passion and sounds to a great extent your passion. So I think, unless we have another hour to go through this, I'm going to try to make it very concise and to the point. And the commitment is that you and I can start, and everyone here attending who wants to really take us on and contribute to that research you talked about and the effort that I'm sure you and I can definitely lead, given that passion. Organizational agility, it better not be just kind of like when you heard the question about the soft skills earlier for next week session, right? It cannot be by the wayside anymore, right? And I'm glad you clarified one more time, because I had to go quickly through a lot of topics today, but you really clarified nicely that we are not talking about agility from a pure agilist kind of a mindset, or extreme agile or scrum masters or anything like that. Nothing wrong with that, but it has its application and its use. We're talking about literally to maybe rewrite a manifesto, rewrite a really way that aligns to this group here around this session and others like us, right? And I remember Antonio saying, oh, great questions, great people attending, etc., which I agree. You know, this is attracting a lot of the smartest minds around the world. I believe you're hearing about 40 some countries attending, is to really work on what applies to our future organizations. What kind of an organization would we want to be part of? Watching Spotify, for example, I believe many people would be jealous. I want to work for Spotify, right? Because it's an environment that is very unlikely similar to many of the organizations many of us around the table today are working in, right? So we need to figure out, whether we call it manifesto or a guide or whatever it is, and it's not necessarily a methodology. We're going to have to really chart the course, and I'm looking forward to working with you on that and getting inputs from around the room. But the reality is, we need to make sure that it's going to be literally like I don't want to use a playbook, but it literally is going to be, a way that is adjustable enough. Remember, the best word that I would summarize a lot of what I said today is how can something get us to understand the context within which organizations operate in the future, but also be in their flow. If we design anything, and if organization agility means designing something that prevents people and processes to be flowing smoothly like a river, I call it, right, a couple of times throughout the session, then we are missing it. So without saying so much about the specifics of it, but the reality of it is, for now, at least in my mind, it's going to have to be around those 4 elements, and the not leaving the individual out of it, not leaving the process out of it, not leaving, the depth, of course, will be on the organization, but not doing that and disconnect with the system, right? Because ultimately, organizations are serving a system, serving an industry, serving a mission, serving an impact, etc. So I'm looking forward to diving into it more, and hope that at least that kind of teased the topic to some extent.
Yeah, very, very interesting indeed. Now I have another question from a friend of mine, Nawaf Al-Ahmadi, from Saudi Arabia. He's also part of PMI. He says currently sustainability is centered around business factors such as cost saving, reputation, risk management, and resource efficiency. But it has now become clear that those factors will not be enough to meet the sustainability challenges the world faces. Can you please shed some light on new dimensions that should be considered?
Yeah. So I hope he attended also Antonio's session, because I think that's where a lot of alignment is between what he was talking about, even though he's focused on the project economy, and I'm focusing more on the organizations of the future. One thing I caught by Antonio is this: what I mentioned earlier, this outward focused kind of a triangle, right? So remember, we have the classic triangles of scope and cost and schedule, etc. And he really talked about engagement and relevance. I almost map 1-to-1 in the kind of organizations in the future from an organizational and operational sustainability standpoint, where I say without making it like only a theme, but living it, without putting the customer in the middle of the thinking process, without the organization looking at, very simply asking the question, why we exist. I cannot tell you how many times I'm working with someone to improve their operational sustainability, and I walk around the room and ask the question, do you know what you're doing here, and what's the correlation between what you're doing and what the business stands for, or what they are, and you get 5 or 6 different answers in a span of 3-4 minutes. So right there tells you, I can work with any operational sustainability. I can't do anything to this business, because at the end of the day, it is not anchored to real crystal clear clarity of the direction, but also it does not allow enough of that very strong team input that you answered many of the polls today, with that being one of the most important ones, right? So again, without debating so much on this right now, I would say yes, 100%. We need to rethink a little bit and very much in detail, how are we going to make this very truly driven by, are we at every given point thinking about the context, thinking about why we exist, what we exist for, who our clients are, both internally and externally, and make sure that almost seamlessly anything we do to excel or sustain or both, that the center of that is relevancy, right? And that's why I like that mindset that Antonio also is stretching a little bit in his session.
Interesting. Now I have a good question here. Doctor, you have spoken about shifting from soft skills to power skills, but I noticed that the answers for the questions which you posted are still majority voted for team involvement I believe that we should move forward to speak about next results, like measuring outcomes now and setting many innovative ideas to be tested instead of still moving formalizing teams.
Yeah, so I can sense this. I can sense some resistance here in the question, which it's going to be given just exactly how you heard your next presenter concerned about, right? So keep in mind that it is an uphill battle for us to finally let go a little bit of the mindset that's very metric driven and more into an enabling driven way of measuring, right? So results are going to be achieved if you get the right team dynamics correctly and you get the right skills of the future in place. They're not the case is not closed yet what these power skills are. I mean, groups like PMI and others are trying to catch the pace and to be amongst the first to really coin the term, etc. But the reality is, you ask 5 or 6 people even around the room today, they're going to have different answers what they are, right? So we know they are in a way building on soft skills, but they are now positioned as, glamorous a little bit being power skills because it's really now seen as very fundamental. But you heard me say, I mentioned in my list, ambidextrity. I can always pronounce that correctly. But anyhow, this ability to balance the exploiting and exploring I was talking about, it's not talked a lot about, but that's huge in leadership. Or the empathy that you heard a little bit, or the adaptability, or that collaboration we talked about from a participative angle. So we're going to have to agree what that is, and we're going to also have to stay fluid in terms of adjusting that. But the reality is we're going to have eventually, and you heard Antonio talk about that, I think, a little bit, but this whole notion of educating upwards, everyone around this room is going to have to really play a massive role in changing the culture and the mindset in our organizations if you really want to have a different place to work in the future, which means stop resisting this. Stop focusing on the short term and the quarter and all of that. Yes, there are shares and everything else and markets to be kept an eye on, but the reality is it's going to take care of itself if we really build the right engine. And the right engine is never going to be built the same way we did before COVID-19. It's going to be built really by realizing what matters, what do we have at the center, and doing that balance people, process, governance, and those terms we addressed today.
Thank you. I think we exhausted you today. There are lots of other questions. I'm going to take the last one.
I'm still fasting. It's still early my time.
Okay. So he's saying, thanks for the great presentation. How does the innovation lens speak to the ultimate off-taker of the project being the customer? You have indicated the 3 spheres of excellence. How will the off-taker part opt in for a full life cycle, full cycle success?
The last thing I didn't hear, off-taker, what's
that? This is what he said. The ultimate off-taker of the project being the customer. Maybe he's talking about the other side of the fence. And this is really a problem that we face all the time. You innovate within an organization and you try to manage your projects and you try to integrate with your strategy and your operation and do something better. Yeah. But to what extent can you achieve excellence when other partners on the other side, like contractors or other organizations you work for, maybe they have less innovation? Before we used to say less maturity, okay? Maybe they do not cope with the speed of or where you are today. Yeah. Maybe this is my understanding to this question.
Yeah, I think we can assume nicely that your assumption about the question is good. So that's perfect. And I'm going to answer it as such because that is a very complex question. That's probably amongst the most complex questions we had this evening. And, the only way I can even begin to tackle this one is back to our ownership of the topic at hand. We really have got to own that we do want to have a different model of working into the future, right? It does include the full ecosystem. It's going to include the supply chain. It's going to include the customer. It's going to include the traditional views we have of sponsors and others. And, again, if you don't really like it, I mean, I'm not sure the environment of flux and change and projects, etc., is the place where you want to be. Because reality is, if you tackle it as a good opportunity for change, you're going to enjoy it. It's going to be tremendously valuable. But you're going to have to invest. When I mentioned educate upwards a while ago, I was more talking about my internal management team and etc. But the reality is, remember I said, what is the one thing that's going to stay with us in the future in terms of our role as leaders? We said, I'm a coach. Yeah. If you really wear this coach hat on all the time, you wear your coach suit or whatever it is, right? And really realize that the only valuable thing I can do, and I can learn throughout that process. Remember, the best coaches are the best learners as well as we talk. That's why we're talking about humbleness. We talked about vulnerability. So the reality is it's very important for us to do like a tilt or like a complete position shift there when it comes to my role as a leader into the future. So if I'm really a coach, and if I'm really want to be successful in getting innovation lens applied, and there are multiple ways to look at the innovation, and there are very nice, there's a 4 innovation lens, also is another book, etc. So if you really want to find ways by which you challenge assumptions, because that's at the core of innovation. Innovation happens when you start diverting from the normal way of thinking, because innovation is not technology only, it's not purely any of that, it's really finding always the new ways of working and the right mix of individuals, etc., and ideas. So as long as I'm finding ways where the value proposition is well explained to the rest of the ecosystem, you got to bring them. It's a stakeholder investment exercise. You got to bring them. I love the fact this guy here is running this series of events. He loves integration. If anything else, I didn't mention that as a power skill in the future, but it's a given. I mean, you cannot operate in the future without integration. And also you heard Antonio talk about simplification and maybe a little bit as well. That's what is needed. So even though it sounds complex, let's simplify it. Let's figure out exactly what's in it for every one of those spokes. It's a spoke, that ecosystem, right? And how can every one of them realize how they are hindering, innovation if they're not playing ball? It's like a nice, sports, exercise when we were back to the sports in the stadium, etc. That's when it all happens. You get the people watching and the players and the trainers and everybody else synchronize. You get yourself a beautiful game.
Okay, there are lots of other questions, and I would like to apologize from all the great participants. I'm sorry we were not able to take all of them. I believe a good presentation or webinar or sharing of ideas always opens the door for even more questions. It's the thing about knowledge. You know what they said, the famous quote, if I've seen further, this is because I stand on the shoulders of giants. Maybe the quote is, you can't correct me. I think this is a place for us to share ideas. Maybe we end up by asking more questions, okay? And this is the way to learn, to explore, and to experiment, and to try and do better for ourselves and our organizations. Now, by this, I'd like to thank you very much, Al. It has really been very rich. I'm personally very happy. Thank you very much.
I'm honored.
I would like to wish everybody a happy Eid coming soon, and stay safe. And thank you very much.
Awesome job for your team as well. Thank you very much.
Awesome job for your team as well. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello, my name is Dr. Saadi Adra. I'm offering a webinar, Breaking Organizational Silos During the Times of Social Distancing. Join me soon.
This is Dr. Ibrahim Shira speaking to you from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We'll be focusing on public-private partnership contracts and privatization contracts. See you.
Hi, my name is Antonio Nieto Rodriguez. I was the chairman of the Project Management Institute in 2016. Today I'm going to talk to you about why project management needs to reinvent itself, and project managers too. So I look forward to see you in my webinar.
Hi, this is Al Zeitoun from Washington, D.C., USA. I look forward to interacting with you on the Advisors webinar titled Balancing People, Process, and Governance for Operational Sustainability. See you then. So long.
Hi there, I'm Radia Benaria from Algeria. I'll be talking to you about emotional intelligence, leadership, and transformational change. I hope you're well. Stay safe.
This is Mustafa Fuzoğlu from Turkey. I'm offering you a webinar with advisors on digital project management.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sean Reagan from California and Prague, and I will be presenting a webinar with advisors on opportunities in crisis and complex situations, so please join me.